Welcome back. Now, the Department of Public Works has been procuring and installing generators, solar systems and inverters at the homes of ministers and their deputies since 2019 at a cost of over 7 million rand to the taxpayer. Now, this information was revealed in a response to a parliamentary question by the Democratic Alliance. And this is in addition to the fact that ministers and their deputies who live in Bryntirion estate in Pretoria are exempt from load shedding due to their proximity to the union buildings. Meanwhile, the National Energy Regulator has approved an increase of 18.5% in electricity tariffs to be paid by the user. The decision is currently legally challenged by political parties, trade unions and civil society. Public policy specialist at Wits School of Governance, Pooe, is in studio with us to share his perspectives on whether South Africa is led by an unaffected and tone-deaf government. TK, good to have you with us. Welcome to Morning Live.
Morning, thanks for having me.
Is our government tone-deaf?
I'd take it a step further. I think our political elite are basically tone-deaf. I mean, you can't... Now, look, even if you take away the issues of the installation of these packs, whatever they may be, you look at how the fact that they've got drivers, they have special benefits, the salaries they earn is not commensurate with the rest of the South African population. So look, I'll say probably from morning till evening, they're very disconnected, and hence we have this issue where they live in different worlds and can make policies without really understanding what most South Africans are going through.
And if you look at that against a backdrop that stipulates that ministers would probably be earning a whole lot more than the general public, with those salaries, they still get these perks. But especially when you look at what the South African population is going through with regard to load shedding and just the lack of electricity generally, ministers then not even, are not even expected to procure this themselves. We, as the taxpayers in South Africa, are still paying for them to have this benefit whereby they generally do not experience load shedding.
Yeah, no, I probably put it in two ways. First, as you said, look, everything you said about them not basically having to account for this. But there's also the bigger problem, because I'd say, look, if we had to put a macro view of this, I'd include issues like premiers and MECs in most of our provinces, because if you put them into the bag, I'm sure it becomes a bit bigger. And then also remember, it's a duplicate. It's the fact that we have this unofficial, well, it's officially three capitals, which is Bloemfontein, Cape Town, and Pretoria. Because I'm sure these duplicates also happen between Pretoria and Cape Town. And really goes back to the old debate of why have we not decided to really move Parliament or basically move our capital to Pretoria to actually cut down on these. And then the second thing, which is we never discuss it, is, the contract that should exist between political elites and the executive and the rest of the population. And which is what you're talking about, which is, look, if you and I move to any work, that burden falls on you to find where you stay and for you to pay those rates. Why is this not the same? And I know they're going to talk about the Ministerial handbook, but to me it seems like a cop-out. It's like saying, look, we found these privileges here, who are we to move them? Well, you've done so many things in this country, why not do this differently?
One could argue, though, as well, that all of this happens with the tacit approval of the electorate and the South African population.
I think, look, living in South Africa is like an omnibus of problems. If you and I have to deal with actual ESCOM issues, you have to deal with traffic, you have to deal with where we live, school fees and everything else. This is probably just who knows what number this problem is. Yes, look, I think as a populist, we have to wake up to the fact that we have a political elite that really is detached. But really, if you look at the offering of all political parties here, even in the opposition, because I know the DA really has done a very sterling job in this, but I'm not hearing them speak about, listen, the issue of having a provincial government, because I think that should be done away with, because that's another added layer of cost that we don't really need in South Africa, because premiers, don't forget, they also form an executive of sorts, right? So for me, it's an issue of saying we need a political party to really say, listen, we're going to actually do away with provinces, we're going to do away with two capitals, and yes, we're actually going to live like most South Africans, because I think, and I always use this example with my students, that if you look what happened in Singapore when COVID hit, their public servants and their politicians were expected to take a pay cut. Because the thinking was, how can we actually have this much money when the rest of the population is suffering? I don't even think we had that debate in South Africa.
Well, you're right in terms of not having had that debate. But when we think of ethical leadership, and yeah, I suppose it's a bit of a stretch, but let's go there. Even if that particular debate isn't started by the general population, ethical leaders should look at themselves, look at their perks and say, at a time when South Africans are really going through the most, should we not be cutting back? Why does there have to be an outcry for leaders to respond to these things?
I like the way you term the term ethical leadership. I always, I find it's a bit of an oxymoron in South Africa in the sense that, look, whose ethics are we speaking about in South Africa? The one guy I always cite, I think we should have really paid attention to what he said is Mr. Ngonyama. He said it quite clearly. I didn't go in the struggle to be poor. So if he's saying, if that's the ethics we understand, then it really should not be surprised how we're going. That's why I think we need to come to almost like a boss parade to say, look, when you say these terms ethics, there's always an assumption that you and I know what we're speaking about. But when you actually speak to people in South Africa, we actually don't have a common ethical ground. That's why I think we should rather go to an issue saying, what is developmental? It doesn't make sense for me developmentally to invest in a political elite and an executive that's not giving us anything in return. I do not deny that you will get certain privileges by being in those positions. If I'm a CEO, there's certain privileges, but it's tied to performance. And I think if we really had to go down that route, then I think there's a lot of things we can cut out. And also then come to a common agreement to say, if you are a member of parliament, if you are the executive, what we expect in return is this. If you do not give that, do not expect anything else. For instance, I don't know why their salaries are above $1 million or even 500,000 when you can be a member of the opposition, you can be a member of the governing party and do nothing for 10 years, but you're going to get something. So I think that's where the conversation should go. Is what you're doing developmental? If it's not, let's cut back.
It goes back to the whole question of why people are in politics to begin with. As you say, the Ngonyama example is a perfect one. But then again, if people are there to serve, at what cost to the nation are you willing to serve then? Because think about it. You look at our elected representatives. You would have encountered them, say, for example, at the airport. One of the things that always gets to me is the fact that people cannot carry their own bags. I don't understand that. But obviously, you have the staff complement where people are literally at your beck and call. Not sure why, because if you look at the provision of how many staff a minister, for example, has at their disposal, the mind boggles. Because you look at that and you compare that to the output, and you seem to wonder who does what and when do they do all of these things? No,
and it is, and it's always sad because when we have to cite examples. I remember living in Germany when I think I had the chance to go to the Bundestag, their version of parliament. At the time, Chancellor Merkel, she does her own shopping. And it's actually quite the norm for their politicians that they have to do it for themselves. Because as you said, it's a privilege to serve your country. And again, we didn't wake you up in the morning, 7 in the morning or 6 in the morning, say, hey, we are so desperate, please come serve us. You wanted to put your best foot forward. But then it would seem as though in return, it's a transactional relationship, right? They'll come to us, probably we're going to start seeing the rumblings now. And then they'll say, listen, vote us in. And then they disappear. But I think this goes back to the point I'm saying about development. I think this would actually should start at the point of local government in our communities, right? Who do we send to parliament? And let's start even at the basics. Who do we send to municipalities? Because I tend to find that's where the problem starts. We as communities don't hold those people responsible, one. And two, we don't want to take an active posture to say, listen, there is a provision in certain, I know, with municipalities where you have to do what's called ward committees, right? We don't actually show up there. And I think until South Africans become community-minded and actually start saying, hey, it really matters who I'm sending to my municipality's council, we're going to be stuck in this thing where they'll come to us every 4 or 5 years and then they'll just get these privileges. Because for us to expect them to make a decision is the wrong way of thinking.
So, speaking to that, the whole notion of active citizenry is one that we also just pay lip service to. Because when it comes down to it, things happen right before our eyes as a community, and our behavior needs to be called into question as well.
No, exactly. I think there's that famous quote which says, I don't blame the people in leadership for what they do. I blame the people that put them there, who keep them there. And I think South Africa, that's the case. But I'm actually quite positive. I think we're starting to move towards that direction. But like you say, it's one thing to be on Twitter. It's great. It's good for whoever uses Twitter. But, you actually need to know who your ward councillor is. You need to actually start paying attention when because now I'm sure we're going to have a lot of these town hall debates. We actually need to ask those hard questions. So say, no, listen, I don't want to deal with an intermediary. Here's my question about my community. And I think most importantly, we need to start asking ourselves, listen, we've seen what the last 30 years have been going to next year. why are we not encouraging the people we know in our communities that actually do great work to say, listen, ma'am, sir, I think you're doing a great job. We, the community trusts you. Why don't you then just take the next foot to say, and this is the difference. We're not saying you're going. Help us to help you to get you to those positions, and let's keep you accountable. Because it would seem as though what we want to do is abscond, which is I vote for you, Sakina, great there, enjoy. I'll see you after 5 years. And you're right saying that culture really needs to start developing where you're doing us a service, but we're also doing you a service by keeping you accountable.
So we hear from the Minister of Public Works, Minister Sihle Zikalala, that government will respond to this latest brouhaha around the perks for ministerial electricity provision, as it were. So the question then becomes, why does government always have to respond? Why does there always have to be an outcry before government does the right thing?
I'm going to put it in using, let's say, Christmas metaphors. We've allowed the chickens to decide what the diet is for Christmas. And the chickens have told us that we should be vegans and we should enjoy green things, not for forgetting that most of us love chicken. So that's how it really works. And look, to maybe put it more academically, I don't get surprised because I always say this point, I don't call them leaders. These are people who, if you found yourself in a position which really you don't need any qualifications for, you don't really need any experience, and most importantly, you don't need to give return on investment for the population, how would you react? Well, you'd react in the same way, which is, why should I actually think about foresight? Why should I think what the next problems are going to be? Why should I actually take the time to think, sit down with people that actually are in the know and say, listen, what's the problems of this country and how do we anticipate it? I wouldn't. That's what leaders do. So for me, I'm not surprised because we don't have leaders. What we have is people that are there. They're just enjoying the Christmas perks that are there. And if you're enjoying the Christmas perks, why should I care what Sakina or the rest of the population think? Because at the end of the day, I'm here, I'm earning my salary. And look, I'll appease them with a few little crumbs by saying, listen, we're going to change the ministerial handbook. And number two, they love this. We're going to set up a commission of inquiry to look at it. We'll take another 4 or 5 years. And then I'll retire with a lovely perk.
So the problem essentially lies with the electorate, with the general population, because, as you say, unless the populace does anything about this, nothing is going to change. So where do you start then as the general population of South Africa? I know you say we should be more involved. There should be a greater deal of active citizenry at play. But apart from that, I think people become despondent when they look at the systems at play and think, well, we can't really make any sort of real change. So what's the point?
Well, look, on this one, and I think to being practical, as you're saying, look, I think we do need, it's simple. Let's say we need to actually flood the minister's office with the emails to say, listen, on this issue of whatever systems you've put on for energy, whether it's inverters or solar, look, we as a citizenry believe it should not be the case. You should be living like the rest of us. So I think that's the first thing we need to do. And we actually need to use the threat of a vote. I know it's one of those things where you have to wait every 5 years, but I think if we put in the relevant emails, and look, unfortunately, this is a sad thing about democracy and when you don't have actual great leaders, is you're stuck in a state of having to look for organizations. I'm saying as a citizen, what I would simply do is, look, I would put in the emails, you would write the articles, and you would actually say, look, listen, let's find like-minded people in the different quarters of South Africa and really push this home to say, listen, you cannot live in a system like this where you're so detached from us that you can even create your own systems of electricity while the rest of us suffer. But I think we then have to go a bit further down. And I always say this, unfortunately, the types of problems we have, looking at it from a policy perspective, it's not something you're going to resolve next year. Our problems are actually 10 years because for every policy mistake you make in South Africa, I think the normal academic truth is it takes about 5 to 10 years to resolve it. So I think that's the first reality we need to come to. That's why I say...
Unless people rise up, as we've seen in other countries, where people have become so... hurtful, as it were, with the situation where they refuse to take it anymore. Because if you think about it, you spoke about the provincial tier of government. This is a conversation that's been going on for many years. But obviously, that is another tier of government that is largely, there for patronage purposes, if you will. Because think about it. So for every portfolio, you have a minister at national level, then you have an MEC, and you have 9 of those across the different provinces. You'd have a deputy minister as well. So that makes it 11 ministers, if you will, technically, for each portfolio. Because MECs, their perks are substantial.
Yeah.
It's not something that you can scoff at.
Yeah, no, it's true. And again, it's one of probably those ignored things. That's what I'm saying. Well, I do go for anger. Anger is a great thing to have, but I tend to find, and look, maybe coming from the Val, we've experienced this in a maybe very different way. We get very angry in the Val that we don't have leadership, that we've got abysmal mayors. But then, and this is a problem I think we find across the continent. Your anger, when it's not directed towards what comes next, becomes problematic. And we've seen it now where people are saying, oh, we cannot wait for the governing party to leave. When the ANC leaves, things will be better. City of Joburg, City of Tshwane, are you better? Type of thing. Because this is where it comes in, where vision is needed. That's what I'm saying. We really also need to say, okay, what then do we put in its place? I mean, I like the point that there's tons of research that shows you guys, provincial government should not exist. Why aren't people forming those lobby groups which say, excuse me, guys, let's get rid of provincial government and really stand on it? And the sad thing, and I always have to say this, democracy, I'm not a fan of democracy. I prefer a system where people were a bit more pragmatic, but unfortunately my system is hybrid because it requires leaders. We need to say, listen, it might take longer than expected, but at least we're moving towards that point. And, I'll use an example. I'm not sure if your views are like or not. If we look at a certain grouping by the name of Freedom AfriForum, they actually swell the ranks. They go to courts. Why don't we have the same thing for South Africa at large? A grouping says, listen, you can come from whatever different political party you want, but on certain issues of getting rid of provincial government, getting rid of these perks, let's just form around that. Because I think that's what South Africans want, where I can actually go to a meeting and say, this is what we want, this is what we're working towards. I don't care who your president is, because you can keep that. That's for you and your issues to live with. But what I want is, I want provincial government to go and I want these perks to go. Let's set that up.
Just case in point, the Free State Premier's home has burned down. What should happen in that instance? Going back to your earlier point, should people not be living in their own homes that they are paying a bond for?
Exactly, especially if you come from that province and that city, then it actually makes better sense. But again, I'll also go back to a point which I'm very passionate about. We need to get rid of having these two capitals. Pretoria should be the capital, things should be, and we've seen it around the world. If I use the example of West Germany and East Germany. Look, for the longest time, Berlin was what it was, and Bonn was the capital of West Germany. What did they do? Understand that if you take Cape Town right now and you take Parliament out, you become problematic, but you actually give them a budget for the next 5 years to say, listen, for the next 5 years, you will get this money regardless. But in these 5 years, we're moving from Cape Town to Pretoria. And I think we'll start seeing costs actually come down. Then we can get to the next thing, which is, why do we have so many ministers in this country?
Well, we were told that there would be fewer. Hasn't happened yet. So TK Pooe is a public policy specialist at the Wits School of Governance, and in studio here talking to us about his perspectives on whether South Africa is led by an unaffected and tone-deaf government, and he certainly believes that is the case.